Every February, millions of people exchange Valentines and celebrate romantic love. The tradition supposedly honors Saint Valentine, a Roman priest martyred for performing secret marriages. But historians who investigate this story find something strange. The romantic elements appeared more than 1,000 years after the saint's death. Today, we will follow the trail from ancient Roman blood sacrifice through medieval poetry to modern greeting cards, discovering how Valentine's Day transformed from a nearly forgotten feast day into a global celebration of romance. The story of Saint Valentine feels familiar to most people. A Christian priest living in Rome during the 3rd century defied imperial orders and performed secret wedding ceremonies for young couples. The Roman emperor had banned marriage for soldiers, believing that unmarried men made better warriors. Valentine disagreed with this law and continued marrying couples in defiance of imperial authority. The story continues with Valentine's arrest and imprisonment. While waiting for execution in a Roman jail, he befriended his jailer and the jailer's blind daughter. According to the legend, Valentine miraculously restored the girl's sight through prayer. Before his execution on February 14th, he wrote her a farewell letter signed with the phrase, "From your Valentine." This narrative appears in books, websites, and greeting cards every February. Teachers share it with students. Parents tell it to children asking about the holiday's origins. The story has emotional appeal. It combines romance, persecution, miracle, and tragic death. It explains why we celebrate love on February 14th and why we sign cards with Valentine's name. The problem emerges when historians examine ancient sources for evidence of these events. Roman records from the 3rd century make no mention of an emperor banning soldier marriages. No contemporary accounts describe a priest named Valentine performing secret weddings. The story of the blind daughter appears nowhere in documents from the period when these events supposedly occurred. Church records do mention a Saint Valentine associated with February 14th. Multiple church calendars from the early medieval period list a martyr named Valentine on this date, but these brief entries provide almost no biographical information. They confirm that someone named Valentine was martyred and that the church commemorated him on February 14th. They say nothing about weddings, imprisonment, or miraculous healings. The detailed story familiar to modern audiences comes from much later sources. Medieval writers, working hundreds of years after the supposed events, created elaborate biographies of early Christian martyrs. These hagiographies combined fragments of historical information with legendary material, miracle stories, and moral lessons. Separating fact from fiction in these texts presents enormous challenges for historians. The situation becomes more complicated when researchers discover that church records mention multiple martyrs named Valentine. The Roman Martyrology, an official catalog of saints, lists several different Valentines associated with February 14th. One Valentine was supposedly a priest in Rome. Another was a bishop in the nearby city of Terni. A third was martyred in North Africa. These multiple Valentines created confusion even in medieval times. Church officials could not determine whether these were 3 different people or the same person described differently in various sources. Some texts merged the different Valentines into a single composite figure. Other documents kept them separate, but provided conflicting details about their lives and deaths. Modern scholars face the difficult task of working backward through this confusion. They must examine texts written centuries after the events they describe, knowing these texts combined history with legend. They must consider the possibility that some or all of the Valentines never existed as described. They must acknowledge the gaps in the historical record and the limits of what can be known with certainty. The question is not whether we should celebrate Valentine's Day. Cultural traditions have value regardless of their historical accuracy. The question is what actually happened in 3rd century Rome and how the story we tell today emerged from those distant events. Understanding this process reveals how legends form, how traditions evolve, and how history gets transformed through centuries of retelling. Before examining the conflicting accounts of Saint Valentine's life, we need to understand the world he supposedly inhabited. 3rd century Rome was undergoing profound changes. Christianity was spreading but remained illegal and periodically persecuted. Traditional Roman religious practices competed with new faiths from across the empire. Into this complex religious landscape, we must place the figure of Valentine. But Rome in February had already established traditions long before any Christian saint. The month held significance in Roman religious life, for reasons having nothing to do with Christianity or romantic love. To understand how February 14th became associated with Saint Valentine, we must first examine what Romans were doing in mid-February before they had ever heard the name Valentine. The Lupercalia was one of Rome's oldest festivals, celebrated annually on February 15th. Ancient Romans believed the ritual dated back to the legendary founding of their city, making it nearly 800 years old by the 3rd century. The festival honored Lupercus, a pastoral god associated with fertility and the protection of flocks from wolves. The festival took place at the Lupercalia, a cave on the Palatine Hill, where Romans believed a she-wolf had nursed the infant twins, Romulus and Remus. This cave held sacred significance as the mythical birthplace of Rome itself. The Lupercalia connected Romans to their legendary origins and reinforced their identity as descendants of divinely favored founders. The ceremony began with the sacrifice of goats and a dog. Priests called Luperci performed these sacrifices at the entrance to the Lupercal cave. The choice of animals held symbolic meaning. Goats represented fertility and sexual potency. The dog's sacrifice related to protection of flocks from predatory wolves. Blood from the sacrificed animals played a central role in subsequent rituals. After the sacrifices, the Luperci smeared blood on the foreheads of two young men from noble families. The priests used a knife still bloody from the animal slaughter to mark the youths. Then they wiped away the blood using wool dipped in milk. The young men were required to laugh during this ritual, though the exact meaning of this requirement remains debated by scholars. The bloodied youths then participated in a sacred meal. The ritual feast included food and wine consumed at the site of the sacrifice. After eating, the young men stripped naked except for goat skin loincloths cut from the freshly sacrificed animals. They were now transformed into the Luperci, the runners who would perform the festival's central ritual. The Luperci ran through the streets of Rome carrying strips of goat skin cut from the sacrificed animals. These strips were called febua, meaning instruments of purification. The runners struck people they encountered with these goatskin thongs as they raced through the city. The festival's route took them around the base of the Palatine Hill, through areas densely populated with Roman citizens. Women deliberately placed themselves in the path of the runners, hoping to be struck by the goatskin thongs. Romans believed that being hit by the febua promoted fertility and ensured safe childbirth. Pregnant women especially sought out the runners, believing the ritual would guarantee easy delivery. The strikes were hard enough to leave marks, but were considered beneficial rather than harmful. The festival's name connects directly to these purification rituals. Februa gave its name to the month itself. February meant the month of purification in Latin. The Lupercalia served as a community-wide purification ceremony, cleansing Rome and its citizens as winter ended and spring approached. The timing aligned with the Roman calendar's original structure, where March was the first month of the year. The Lupercalia also included a matchmaking element, though historical sources describe this aspect less clearly than the purification rituals. Young women's names were reportedly placed in an urn. Young men drew names from the urn, creating pairings for the coming year. These pairings might lead to sexual relationships or eventual marriages. Some modern scholars question whether this lottery actually occurred or was a later addition to the tradition. The festival represented ancient Roman religion at its most primal. Unlike the sophisticated philosophical interpretations of gods that educated Romans discussed, the Lupercalias preserved archaic practices rooted in pastoral life and agricultural cycles. The ritual's emphasis on blood, nakedness, and physical striking seemed crude to some Romans even in ancient times. Yet the festival persisted for centuries precisely because of its ancient origins. Romans valued tradition and continuity with their past. Abandoning festivals that honored the gods risked divine displeasure. The Lupercalia continued even as Rome transformed from a small city-state into a vast empire controlling the Mediterranean world. Emperors themselves sometimes participated or sponsored the ceremonies. By the 3rd century, however, the religious landscape of Rome was changing dramatically. Christianity had spread throughout the empire despite periodic persecutions. Traditional Roman religious practices faced competition from various Eastern mystery religions. Educated Romans increasingly viewed old festivals like the Lupercalia with embarrassment, seeing them as barbaric remnants of a primitive past. Christian writers condemned the Lupercalia with particular vehemence. They saw the festival as pagan superstition at best and demonic ritual at worst. The emphasis on fertility, the nakedness of the runners, and the implied sexual elements offended Christian moral sensibilities. Christian Romans refused to participate, creating social tensions as the new faith spread through the population. The conflict between Christianity and traditional Roman religion intensified during the 3rd century. Several emperors launched systematic persecutions attempting to force Christians to participate in traditional religious ceremonies. Christians who refused faced imprisonment, property confiscation, and execution. These persecutions varied in intensity depending on the emperor and the region. Into this context of religious conflict came the figure of Valentine. If a Christian priest named Valentine lived in 3rd century Rome, he inhabited a world where traditional festivals like the Lupercalia remained central to civic life. February brought not romantic love, but blood sacrifice and fertility rituals. The month honored ancient gods that Christians rejected as false idols or demons. The eventual transformation of February 15th from pagan fertility festival to Christian feast day took centuries to accomplish. The process required the decline of traditional Roman religion, the triumph of Christianity, and deliberate efforts by church authorities to replace pagan practices with Christian alternatives. The Lupercalia would eventually disappear, but not until long after any historical Valentine had died. Understanding the Lupercalia helps clarify what Valentine's Day was not in its origins. The February celebration in ancient Rome had nothing to do with romantic love, courtship, or choosing partners based on affection. It focused on fertility, purification, and the propitiation of ancient gods. The connection between mid-February and romance emerged much later through a completely different process. The question remains, who was the Christian martyr whose feast day would eventually replace this ancient festival? To answer that question, we must examine the fragmentary evidence that survives about the various men named Valentine who were martyred in the 3rd century. The investigation reveals more questions than answers and demonstrates how little historians actually know about the saint whose name defines February 14th. The earliest reliable reference to Saint Valentine appears in the chronography of 354, a Roman calendar compiled approximately a century after the supposed martyrdom. This calendar lists Valentine among martyrs commemorated on February 14th. The entry provides no biographical details, no description of his life, or no explanation of why he was martyred. It simply records the name and date. This brief mention establishes only that by the mid-4th century, Roman Christians recognized a martyr named Valentine associated with February 14th. The calendar says nothing about secret marriages, imprisoned lovers, or miraculous healings. Those elements appear nowhere in this earliest reference. The historical Valentine, if he existed, remains almost completely obscure in contemporary sources. Later, church documents complicate rather than clarify the picture. The Roman martyrology, compiled over several centuries, lists multiple Valentines martyred on or near February 14th. These entries describe different men in different locations, creating confusion about whether they refer to separate individuals or represent variant traditions about the same person. The first Valentine mentioned in most sources is described as a priest of Rome. According to later hagiographies, this Valentine ministered to persecuted Christians during the reign of Emperor Claudius II, who ruled from 268 to 270. The priest supposedly performed marriages for Christian couples and aided Christians imprisoned for their faith. These activities led to his arrest and eventual execution. The second Valentine appears in sources as a bishop of Terni, a city about 60 miles from Rome. This Valentine supposedly traveled to Rome at some point and performed miracles that attracted official attention. He was arrested, interrogated by the emperor, and executed when he refused to renounce his faith. His body was reportedly returned to Terni for burial. Some medieval sources attempt to reconcile these two accounts by suggesting they describe the same person. Perhaps Valentine was a priest in Rome who later became bishop of Terni. Or perhaps he was bishop of Terni but was martyred during a visit to Rome. These harmonizing attempts create a single narrative from contradictory sources, but they may simply multiply the confusion. A third Valentine appears in some martyrologies as a martyr in the Roman province of Africa. Almost nothing is known about this figure. The sources provide no details about his life, his activities, or the circumstances of his death. He exists in the historical record as little more than a name on a list of African martyrs. Some scholars doubt he ever existed as a distinct individual. Well, the problem facing historians is determining which, if any, of these Valentines actually existed and what can be reliably known about them. The sources describing their lives were written centuries after the supposed events. These hagiographies routinely embellished martyr stories with legendary material, miracle accounts, and standardized narrative elements that appeared in multiple saint biographies. The most detailed account appears in a text called the Passio Sancti Valentini, which translates as the Passion of Saint Valentine. This Latin text, surviving in multiple medieval manuscripts, provides the familiar narrative elements: the emperor's marriage ban, Valentine's secret ceremonies, his imprisonment, and the miracle involving the jailer's daughter. But this text was composed centuries after Valentine's supposed death. Scholars who analyze the Passio Sancti Valentini find numerous problems with treating it as historical evidence. The text contains anachronisms and historical errors. It describes customs and practices that did not exist in 3rd century Rome. The narrative follows formulaic patterns found in other hagiographies, suggesting the author worked from literary conventions rather than historical sources. The central claim in the legend, that Emperor Claudius II banned marriage for soldiers, finds no support in Roman historical sources. Numerous documents survive from Claudius II's brief reign. None mention such a marriage prohibition. Roman historians who chronicled the period make no reference to this supposedly significant policy. The marriage ban appears to be a later invention rather than historical fact. Some defenders of the tradition argue that the marriage ban might have been a local or temporary measure that escaped notice in surviving sources. However, this explanation requires assuming that a policy significant enough to motivate a priest's martyrdom somehow left no trace in the extensive Roman bureaucratic records, legal texts, or historical chronicles. The simpler explanation is that the ban never existed. The story of the jailer's blind daughter presents similar problems. This narrative element appears nowhere in the earliest references to Valentine. It emerges only in later medieval texts. The story follows patterns common in hagiographies, where saints perform miracles that convert their captors or demonstrate divine power to pagan authorities. The account fits literary conventions more than historical probability. The supposed letter signed, "From your Valentine," is even more problematic as historical evidence. No such letter survives from the 3rd century. No contemporary source mentions Valentine writing to anyone from prison. The first references to this letter appear more than 1,000 years after Valentine's death, well after the custom of exchanging. Valentines had already developed in medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence provides no help in resolving these questions. Several churches claim to possess relics of Saint Valentine, including skulls and other bones. Rome's Basilica of Santa Maria in Cosmedin displays what it identifies as Valentine's skull. The Whitefriars Street Church in Dublin also claims to house Valentine's remains. These competing claims cannot all be correct, and none can be verified through scientific testing that would establish dates or identities. The multiplication of Valentine relics across Europe reflects medieval practices rather than historical reality. Churches competed to acquire holy relics, which attracted pilgrims and generated revenue. Enterprising relic merchants supplied demand by subdividing supposed saint remains or simply fabricating them. The existence of multiple churches claiming Valentine's body parts tells us more about medieval religious economics than about the historical Valentine. What then can historians say with confidence about Saint Valentine? Very little, unfortunately. A Christian named Valentine was probably martyred in Rome or its vicinity sometime in the 3rd century. The church commemorated this martyr on February 14th by at least the 4th century. Beyond these bare facts, the details remain uncertain, contradictory, or obviously legendary. The lack of reliable biographical information did not prevent Valentine from becoming a widely venerated saint. Medieval Christians cared less about historical accuracy than about spiritual edification and devotional practice. A saint's legendary deeds mattered more than verifiable facts about their life. The stories served religious and moral purposes regardless of their historical basis. This uncertainty about the historical Valentine raises an important question. If the romantic elements of his story are later additions, and if the biographical details cannot be verified, when and how did Valentine become associated with romantic love? And the answer requires jumping forward several centuries from Valentine's obscure martyrdom to a specific moment in medieval England when a poet made an offhand reference that would change Valentine's legacy forever. But before examining that medieval transformation, we need to understand what happened in the centuries immediately following Valentine's death. How did the church deal with the Lupercalia festival? When did February 14th officially become Saint Valentine's feast day? What was that feast day supposed to commemorate before it had anything to do with romance? These questions take us to the late 5th century and to a pope determined to eliminate pagan practices from Christian Rome. Pope Gelasius I assumed leadership of the church in 492 during a period of tremendous change. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed just 16 years earlier. Germanic kingdoms now controlled Italy and much of the former imperial territory. Christianity had become the dominant religion, but pagan practices persisted stubbornly, especially among rural populations and in traditional urban festivals. The Lupercalia remained one of the most visible surviving pagan festivals. Despite Christian dominance, Romans continued celebrating the February ritual with its naked runners, blood sacrifices, and fertility rites. Church authorities found this persistence embarrassing and troubling. How could Christianity claim victory over paganism when Roman citizens still participated enthusiastically in festivals honoring ancient gods? Gelasius confronted this problem directly. In 494 or 495, he wrote a letter to a Roman senator named Andromachus, who had defended the Lupercalia. The letter survives today and provides remarkable insight into the conflict between Christian authorities and traditionalists who wished to preserve ancient Roman customs. Gelasius argued forcefully for the festival's abolition. The Pope's arguments combined practical and theological reasoning. He noted that the Lupercalia had supposedly prevented plague and ensured fertility, Yet Rome had suffered numerous plagues and famines despite faithful celebration of the festival. If the ritual actually worked, these disasters would not have occurred. The continued problems proved the festival's ineffectiveness and demonstrated that pagan gods possessed no real power. Gelasius also attacked the festival on moral grounds. He described the Lupercalia as obscene and inappropriate for Christian citizens. The nakedness of the runners, the physical striking of women, and the festival's association with sexual license offended Christian moral sensibilities. Romans who participated in such practices while claiming to be Christians were hypocrites who dishonored their faith. The letter reveals that some Romans defended the Lupercalia not from religious conviction but from cultural conservatism. They argued that abandoning ancient traditions invited disaster. The festivals had served Rome well for centuries, and discontinuing them might anger forces beyond human understanding. This argument from tradition proved surprisingly durable even among nominally Christian Romans. Gelasius rejected this reasoning entirely. He insisted that Christians must break completely with pagan practices, regardless of their antiquity. The old gods were false idols or demons. Rituals honoring them served evil purposes, whether participants recognized this or not. Christians had obligations to abandon such practices, even if doing so meant breaking with centuries of tradition. Whether Gelasius successfully banned the Lupercalia immediately remains debated among historians. Some sources suggest the festival continued in some form for several more decades. Other evidence indicates that participation declined rapidly after the Pope's condemnation. By the mid-6th century, references to the Lupercalia disappear from historical sources, suggesting the festival had finally ended after more than a millennium of continuous celebration. The Church's strategy for replacing pagan festivals involved establishing Christian feast days at the same times of year. Rather than leaving the calendar empty, Church authorities created Christian observances that filled the dates previously occupied by pagan celebrations. This approach provided continuity while changing the religious meaning. People could maintain seasonal rhythms while directing their devotion toward Christian rather than pagan purposes. February 14th became the official feast day for Saint Valentine, replacing the Lupercalia's traditional date of February 15th. Whether Gelasius himself established this feast day or whether it already existed remains uncertain. Some scholars believe the Valentine feast predated Gelasius and provided a convenient Christian alternative he could promote. Others think Gelasius created or elevated the feast day specifically to replace the Lupercalia. Regardless of precise timing, the establishment of Saint Valentine's feast day in mid-February served a strategic purpose. The date replaced a pagan fertility festival with a Christian martyrs commemoration. Romans could still mark the season, but would now honor a Christian saint rather than ancient gods. The substitution demonstrated Christianity's triumph over paganism symbolically and practically. However, and this point is crucial, the feast of Saint Valentine had nothing to do with romantic love. The Church created the feast day to honor a martyr who had died for his faith. Medieval Christians observed Valentine's feast by attending Mass, praying for the saint's intercession, and perhaps fasting or performing other devotional acts. Nothing in the religious observance involved courtship, romance, or choosing partners. For nearly 900 years after Gelasius established or promoted Saint Valentine's feast day, no source connects Valentine with romantic love. Medieval calendars list February 14th as the commemoration of Saint Valentine the Martyr. Religious texts describe him as an example of faithfulness unto death. Churches dedicated to Saint Valentine focus on his martyrdom and his role as an intercessor for those suffering persecution or illness. This absence of romantic associations deserves emphasis because modern people often assume the connection is ancient. The story of Valentine secretly marrying couples seems to explain why we celebrate romance on his feast day. But the historical sequence works in reverse. The romantic associations came first, and the story about secret marriages was invented later to explain traditions that had developed for completely different reasons. So if Valentine's feast day commemorated martyrdom rather than romance for 9 centuries, when and how did the romantic associations emerge? The transformation occurred not through gradual evolution, but through a specific literary moment. A single poet, writing in medieval England, made an observation about birds that would eventually transform an obscure martyr's feast day into a global celebration of romantic love. The gap between 496 and 1382 represents a historical silence that modern Valentine's Day narratives typically ignore. When people tell the story of Valentine performing secret marriages and writing romantic letters, they create a false continuity between the ancient martyr and the modern holiday. Or the actual history contains a 9-century gap during which Valentine had no connection whatsoever to romance. Understanding this gap matters because it reveals how traditions form and how historical narratives get constructed. People naturally assume that modern practices have ancient origins. They create stories that explain present customs by projecting them backward into the past. The Valentine's Day origin story serves this function perfectly by providing an ancient romantic precedent for a tradition that actually began in the late Middle Ages. The question now becomes, what happened in 1382 that connected Valentine with romance? How did an obscure martyr whose feast day meant nothing special for 9 centuries suddenly become associated with courtship and love? The answer involves poetry, birds, and a court celebration where England's most famous poet made an observation that would echo across the following 6 centuries. Geoffrey Chaucer was the most accomplished English poet of the 14th century. He served in the royal court, traveled extensively on diplomatic missions, and wrote works that would define English literature for centuries. His most famous work, The Canterbury Tales, remains widely read today. But for the history of Valentine's Day, a much shorter poem matters more. In 1382, Chaucer composed a poem titled Parlement aux Foules, or Parliament of Fowls in modern spelling. The poem celebrates the first anniversary of the engagement between King Richard II of England and Anne of Bohemia. Chaucer wrote it as occasional verse, poetry created for a specific courtly event. He could not have known that this relatively minor work would create a tradition lasting 6 centuries. The poem describes a dream vision in which the narrator witnesses a parliament of birds gathering to choose their mates. The goddess Nature presides over this assembly, which takes place on Saint Valentine's Day. The birds debate which suitors should win their desired partners. 3 male eagles compete for a female eagle's favor, each arguing why she should choose him. The other birds grow impatient with this aristocratic courtship drama. The crucial lines appear near the poem's beginning. Chaucer writes that birds come together on Saint Valentine's Day to choose their mates. This represents the first known association between Valentine's feast day and romantic courtship. No earlier source connects Valentine with love or matchmaking. Chaucer appears to have invented this association, or at minimum recorded a very recent tradition that left no earlier written trace. Why did Chaucer choose St. Valentine's Day for his bird parliament? Several theories attempt to explain this decision. Some scholars suggest that mid-February corresponds to the beginning of the avian mating season in England, though bird behavior experts note that most English birds actually begin mating later in spring. The connection between February and bird mating may reflect folk belief rather than accurate observation. Another theory proposes that Chaucer chose Valentine's feast day simply because it fell near the royal engagement anniversary he was commemorating. The date provided a convenient peg for his poem without deeper symbolic meaning. Chaucer needed a saint's day in mid-February. Valentine's feast occurred at the right time, and the choice was essentially arbitrary. A third possibility suggests that Chaucer was making a sophisticated literary joke. By placing a courtship ritual on the feast of a martyr, he created an ironic contrast between romantic love and religious devotion. Medieval audiences, familiar with both courtly love poetry and hagiography, might have appreciated this juxtaposition. The joke, if it was one, succeeded far beyond any intention Chaucer might have had. Whatever Chaucer's motivation, his poem established a connection that other poets quickly adopted. Within a few decades, multiple English and French poets were writing Valentine's Day poems about love and courtship. These works reference Chaucer's innovation, confirming that he originated the tradition. By the early 15th century, celebrating Valentine's Day as a day for lovers had become an established practice among the aristocracy. The earliest Valentine's Day love letter that survives dates to 1415. Charles, Duke of Orleans, wrote it while imprisoned in the Tower of London following his capture at the Battle of Agincourt. He sent a poem to his wife in France, addressing her as his Valentine. The poem survives today in the British Library. Its existence demonstrates that within 30 years of Chaucer's poem, people were exchanging romantic messages on Valentine's Day. The practice spread through the aristocracy during the 15th century. Nobles exchanged elaborate handwritten valentines expressing devotion and desire. These weren't simple greeting cards, but sophisticated poems demonstrating literary skill and courtly refinement. Creating an impressive Valentine required education, leisure time, and access to expensive materials like quality paper and ink. The tradition remained largely confined to the upper classes. The concept of courtly love shaped these early Valentine exchanges. This medieval literary tradition emphasized refined, often unrequited passion between a noble lover and his idealized lady. Courtly love poetry used elaborate metaphors, described the lover's suffering, and portrayed love as ennobling and spiritually significant. Valentine's Day. Poetry drew heavily on these conventions, making the day a celebration of romantic idealism. By the 16th century, Valentine's Day customs had expanded beyond poetry exchange. People drew names to determine Valentines in matchmaking games similar to those once associated with the Lupercalia. Young men and women paired up for the day through random selection. These pairings carried romantic possibilities but remained lighthearted rather than binding. The customs represented flirtation and entertainment more than serious courtship. Shakespeare references Valentine's Day in several plays, confirming the tradition's establishment in popular culture by the late 16th century. In Hamlet, Ophelia sings a song about Saint Valentine's Day that contains sexual innuendo. The reference assumes audience familiarity with Valentine customs. Shakespeare treats the day as an occasion for romantic and sexual possibilities rather than religious observance. The religious meaning of Saint Valentine's feast day diminished as romantic associations grew stronger. By the 17th century, most English people knew Valentine's Day primarily as a secular celebration of romance rather than a saint's commemoration. Churches still observed the feast technically, but popular culture had transformed its significance. The martyr was becoming subordinate to the holiday bearing his name. It was only after this transformation that storytellers began inventing romantic biographies for Saint Valentine. The legend of the priest who performed secret marriages emerges in 17th century sources. Writers needed to explain why Valentine's feast day had become associated with romance. They created stories projecting the modern holiday's meaning backward onto the ancient saint. The narrative satisfied curiosity, even though it reversed actual historical causation. The story about Valentine restoring sight to his jailer's blind daughter and writing her a letter signed "From your Valentine" appears even later. These elements seem designed specifically to explain Valentine's Day card traditions. The letter provides an origin story for signing Valentines. The miracle proves Valentine's association with love and compassion. These narrative elements serve explanatory purposes rather than recording historical events. By the 18th century, Valentine's Day had become thoroughly commercialized in England. Printers produced and sold Valentine cards with printed verses. These mass-produced cards allowed people without poetic skill to participate in Valentine exchanges. The cards featured elaborate decorations including lace, ribbons, and colorful images. The Valentine card industry was born, worse, though it would reach far greater scale in the following century. The transformation was complete. A minor saint's feast day had become a major secular celebration of romantic love. The change occurred not through gradual evolution over centuries, but through a specific literary innovation followed by enthusiastic cultural adoption. Chaucer's poem in 1382 created the association. Subsequent poets elaborated it. Popular culture embraced it. Commercial interests eventually exploited it. The process took roughly 400 years from Chaucer to mass-produced Valentines, preparing the ground for Valentine's Day to become a global commercial phenomenon. The 19th century transformed Valentine's Day from an aristocratic custom into a mass phenomenon. Several developments converged to create this change. Literacy rates increased across Europe and North America, expanding the population capable of reading and writing Valentine messages. Postal systems improved, making it practical to send cards over long distances. Most importantly, industrial production made Valentines affordable for ordinary people. The first commercially printed Valentines appeared in England during the late 18th century, but production remained limited and expensive. Early cards were often hand-painted or decorated with expensive materials. Only relatively wealthy buyers could afford them. The market remained small until technological innovations reduced production costs and allowed manufacturers to produce Valentines in large quantities. Esther Howland revolutionized the American Valentine industry in the 1840s. After receiving an elaborate English Valentine, Howland recognized commercial possibilities. She began importing lace paper and other materials from England and assembling Valentines in her Worcester, Massachusetts home. Her designs combined imported materials with American production, creating distinctive cards that appealed to middle-class buyers. Howland's business grew rapidly. She employed workers who assembled Valentines in a production system that anticipated modern manufacturing methods. Different workers specialized in specific tasks, cutting paper, applying decorations, or packaging finished cards. By the 1850s, Howland's company was producing thousands of Valentines annually and earning substantial profits. She became known as the mother of the American Valentine. The Valentine card industry expanded throughout the second half of the 19th century. Multiple companies competed for market share. Cards became increasingly elaborate, incorporating new materials and techniques. Manufacturers used embossed paper, silk, satin, feathers, shells, and artificial flowers. Some cards included mechanical elements that moved when opened. Innovation focused on creating cards that impressed recipients and justified their purchase price. Not all Valentines were romantic. Vinegar Valentines, or penny dreadfuls, emerged as an alternative tradition. These cards featured insulting verses and caricatures mocking the recipient's appearance, occupation, or character. People sent vinegar valentines to reject unwanted suitors, express contempt for rivals, or simply be cruel. The tradition reveals Victorian-era Valentine customs had darker elements alongside romantic sentimentality. The late 19th century saw chocolate manufacturers recognize Valentine's Day's commercial potential. Richard Cadbury of the famous English chocolate company began producing heart-shaped boxes filled with chocolates, specifically for Valentine's Day in 1868. The boxes themselves were designed to be kept as decorative items after the chocolates were consumed. This innovation created a lasting association between chocolate and Valentine's Day. American confectioners quickly adopted similar strategies. By the early 20th century, chocolate hearts, candy conversation hearts with printed messages, and other Valentine-themed sweets had become standard offerings. The New England Confectionery Company, known as Necco, began producing conversation hearts in 1902. These small candy hearts printed with romantic phrases became an iconic Valentine's Day product lasting over a century. Florists also capitalized on Valentine's Day, though roses became the definitive flower somewhat later. The association between red roses and romantic love predates Valentine's Day by centuries, drawing on medieval symbolism where roses represented passion and beauty. Florists successfully marketed roses as the appropriate Valentine's Day gift, creating demand that spiked dramatically every February and allowed them to charge premium prices. The 20th century brought further commercialization. Jewelry companies marketed Valentine's Day as an ideal occasion for giving diamond rings and other expensive items. Restaurants promoted Valentine's Day dinners for couples. Hotels offered romantic getaway packages. While greeting card companies expanded beyond Valentine's to produce cards for every conceivable relationship, from traditional romantic partners to parents, children, teachers, and pets. Hallmark cards, founded in 1910, became particularly influential in shaping modern Valentine's Day. The company produced Valentines in enormous quantities and variety, providing cards for every possible sentiment and relationship type. Hallmark's marketing emphasized that Valentine's Day was for expressing appreciation to everyone you cared about, not just romantic partners. This broader definition expanded the potential market substantially. Valentine's Day spread globally during the 20th century, though adoption patterns varied by region. Japan adopted Valentine's Day in the 1950s but developed unique customs. Japanese women give chocolates to men on February 14th. Men reciprocate exactly 1 month later on White Day, an invented holiday created by confectionery companies. This gendered gift-giving pattern differs substantially from Western practices. Other countries adapted Valentine's Day to local cultures with varying degrees of enthusiasm. In India, Valentine's Day gained popularity among young urban populations in the 1990s, though conservative groups sometimes protest it as Western cultural imperialism. Latin American countries often celebrate Dia del Amor y la Amistad, expanding the focus beyond romantic love to include friendship. These variations demonstrate how global customs adapt to local contexts. Contemporary Valentine's Day represents massive economic activity. Americans alone spend over $25 billion annually on Valentine's Day. This spending includes nearly $2 billion on flowers, $4 billion on jewelry, $3 billion on candy, and $2 billion on restaurant meals. Millions more go to greeting cards, gifts for children's classroom exchanges, and presents for pets. The economic impact extends across multiple industries. Digital technology has transformed but not diminished Valentine's Day commerce. E-cards supplement physical cards. Online retailers capture increasing shares of gift sales. Social media provides platforms for public declarations of affection that previous generations would have kept private. Dating apps promote Valentine's Day as crucial for relationship development. Technology changes how people celebrate but maintains commercial pressures to participate. The critics argue that modern Valentine's Day exemplifies commercialization's triumph over authentic emotion. The holiday creates pressure to demonstrate love through purchased goods rather than genuine feeling or meaningful action. Single people report feeling excluded or inadequate. Even couples sometimes resent obligation replacing spontaneity. Yet the holiday persists and grows, suggesting it fulfills needs beyond what critics acknowledge. The distance between a 3rd century martyr and contemporary consumer culture could hardly be greater. What can historians say with confidence about Valentine's Day's origins? Very little about the ancient saint himself. A Christian martyr named Valentine died in 3rd century Rome and was commemorated on February 14th by at least the 4th century. Beyond these minimal facts, biographical details remain uncertain or obviously legendary. The stories about secret marriages, miraculous healings, and romantic letters were invented centuries after any historical Valentine died. The connection between Valentine and romantic love originated in 1382, when Geoffrey Chaucer wrote a poem associating Valentine's feast day with birds choosing mates. This literary innovation had no basis in earlier tradition or religious observance. Subsequent poets and popular culture adopted Chaucer's association, gradually transforming an obscure martyr's feast into a celebration of romance. Commercial interests then amplified and exploited this transformation, creating the modern holiday. This history matters because it demonstrates how traditions form and how narratives explaining those traditions get constructed after the fact. People naturally assume customs have ancient origins. They create stories that project present practices backward into the past. The Valentine legend serves this function perfectly, providing an emotionally satisfying explanation for modern customs that actually developed through completely different processes. Understanding this reveals something important about how cultures work. The Valentine's Day we celebrate today connects to the ancient saint primarily through shared nomenclature. The romantic customs, commercial practices, and cultural meanings we associate with February 14th would be utterly foreign to anyone who knew the historical Valentine or observed his feast day before the late Middle Ages. This does not invalidate the holiday or make celebrating it somehow wrong. Cultural traditions need not be ancient to be meaningful, but understanding what actually happened provides a valuable perspective on a day that millions observe without knowing its complicated, fragmentary, and often invented history.